Good morning, Megan. Thanks a lot for taking the time to talk to us on 10 Across Conversations.
Good morning. I'm happy to be here.
And I know you have a busy schedule. You've been touring the country with regard to your book, City Limits, Infrastructure, Inequality, and the Future of America's Highways. So we're privileged to have you on today to dig a little deeper into the book. So again, thanks for making time for us. So first of all, give us a little background about why you got into this topic, because I know you've lived in many areas along the 10, by the way. Austin, we sort of consider that along the 10, but LA, Tucson, and elsewhere. Tell us about how you got into writing this book and your background that might have led to it.
Yeah, I feel like there is a pretty good story that revolves around the 10 freeway. So I grew up outside Los Angeles, and after college, I lived in Santa Monica and worked downtown. And so I was on the 10 every day, commuting to work. I was trying to be a journalist. I was working as an editorial assistant at the LA Times, but didn't make very much money. So I had to work I worked as a tutor to high school students, sort of spread across West LA. So I was often spending 3 or 4 hours a day in the car, driving to my shift at the LA Times and then across West LA to students' homes. And it was crushing. It was very sort of a soul-crushing existence, the amount of driving that I had to do. And then I moved to Tucson for graduate school. I went to the University of Arizona to get an MFA in creative nonfiction. And moving from Los Angeles, the kind of grinding existence on the freeways of LA, to Tucson was this kind of like, it was this revelation. I remember this was like before smartphones. So I used to was glued to the traffic reports in right. LA, switching between the 2 NPR stations to get the 2 traffic reports, printing out Google Maps. I had this pile in my passenger seat of Google Maps. And then I moved to Tucson and I walked to class. I lived right near the university. All my friends lived near me. The gym was nearby. The grocery was nearby. I just didn't have to drive. Traffic simply did not apply. And that change in my quality of life was so significant. And then kind of fast forward 7 years, I did a lot of things in Tucson. I wrote my first book about food. I was the editor of a local food magazine. But I moved to Austin in 2017, largely to be nearer to my family. My sister lives here with her kids and husband. And I moved to Austin and suddenly kind of had the reverse experience of moving to a city where I had to drive all of the time. And the change in my quality of life was significant. And, Austin is sort of touted as this progressive bastion in conservative Texas. It's right. Has a lot of branding. And I arrived here and it was I sure feel like I'm spending a lot of time in my car. I tried to bike, I tried to take the bus, and neither were very accessible. They didn't get me where I needed to go. And I think that personally led me to the question of why is it like this? Why is it so hard to bike in most American cities? Why is there no good transit? And so I had that kind of personal epiphany, but kind of parallel to that, I was working as a journalist. I got a job at the Texas Observer, which is a nonprofit magazine based in Austin, and started covering housing across the state. And wrote the kind of thing that catalyzed the book was I wrote a story about Austin's zoning code. So at the time, Austin had not updated its zoning code since 1984. So as the city has boomed, most of that growth happened at the fringes, in the sprawl. And as a result, people who wanted to buy homes were priced out of the city, bought homes in right. suburbs like Round Rock or Pflugerville or Kyle or Buda, and drove on I-35 back to their jobs and schools. So, I talked to people who said, I would love to live in central Austin, but I can't afford it, largely because our zoning code has throttled the construction of new homes, denser homes like apartments or duplexes. And so as a result, they're on I-35 all the time. And I wrote this story about kind of just looking at the zoning code. And then in April of 2020, the Texas Department of Transportation allocated nearly $5 billion to expand I-35 through Austin. And I thought, that sure seems like the same story. The housing policy that has created sprawl leads to car dependence. And car dependence has all sorts of negative consequences for our cities, for our environment, for our the social fabric of our cities. The history of these freeways is very racist. And that really kind of got me going on the book. So
you obviously have a keen eye and you're a close observer of what you're doing and what people are doing around you. And the linkage between highways and housing, of course, is profound. And I appreciate that observation as well. But going back to LA, it's interesting with regard to the fire that happened under the 10 in November. I understand you're not in LA anymore, but with regard to perceiving things that you would think as large as they are and as impactful as they are, and you mentioned the book, sometimes a highway is a hard thing to perceive. Once there was no traffic after the fire, suddenly you could see the 10 for what it was. This massive construction, monumental divider of the city. And sometimes I said this to another person who's written a really interesting book recently as well, that sometimes things have to be in a state of disuse for us to see them maybe for the first time for really what they are, because we're too busy driving or we're too busy doing other things to perceive the world around us. Have you had that experience of being able to stand back and really see a highway differently, you think, because of your, again, powers of observation or something else?
Well, I had that exact experience when I started reporting the book during COVID. It was April 2020. No one was driving. Everyone was home. And yet the Texas Transportation Commission, which oversees TxDOT, was, meeting on Zoom saying, we are going to have this cataclysmic congestion in our future unless we allocate this money to expand this highway. Meanwhile, I drove on it. Lots of people went out and saw these structures as the amount of space they take up in our cities. Right. And I think that was really revealed during COVID when people weren't commuting. You could just see the amount of land that we have given to cars. And that was seen in like places like New York City, where a lot of streets were turned over to like pedestrians or outdoor dining. And that happened in lots of different places. But I think in Texas, what was so revealing was like how outsized these highway structures are. And that really became so apparent when like no one was on them. And yet we were still on track to spend, billions upon billions of dollars to make them even bigger.
Yeah. And another thing you mentioned in the book, which relates to my own personal experience, by the way, you mentioned Akron, Ohio, of all places, not just highways on the 10, where I was born and spent a lot of my life. But the way that we think about the use of space in cities and roads was sort of, there was an attempt to overcome that with grandiose models of future cities. And Norman Bell Getty's models at the World's Fair, and Frank Lloyd Wright's Broadacre City, which was, that model was built out here in Phoenix. There was a belief that somehow roadways and cities could coexist in this remarkable way and create humane environments. And the car companies and governments, I suppose, bought into that. But the perception is so far from that reality. It's your thoughts on what was being pitched and why it was being bought at the time. Why did people buy into that? Or did they just want to believe it?
Yeah, I really wanted to start from a place of like empathy for the city planners of the 20s and 30s who really saw the car as this savior. Like there's so many instances where cars were sold as the way to like clean up cities. They were going to save cities from ruin, which, like when horses were the only form of urban transportation, like cities were pretty dirty. I think an understandable appetite to clean up cities just from a pure kind of street sanitation perspective. And the car also offered this vision of like a technological future. Like we were going to be autonomous. We were going to have independence. Like until the car came along, if you wanted to go somewhere, you had to wait for a train or bus to take you there and hope that the train or bus was going where you wanted to go. So like it really limited freedom of movement, and cars were presented as this like unbelievable freedom, which in fact they do offer. I think so I really wanted to start with Magic Motorways and the kind of Norman Bell Getty's vision of tomorrow, because like what people were sold, particularly after a world war and a depression, was this like vision of a prosperous future where people could spread out, they could have land to themselves, they could get outside of the city. Like that would be more accessible to people of modest means. Before the car, if you wanted to get out of the city, you had to have a lot of money. And so I like really kind of empathize with the vision that was sold and why people bought into it. I think what I really tried to document in the book is that very quickly became clear that that promise would not be realized, that cars actually weren't incredibly dirty, that they polluted the air, that they offered a lot of noise pollution, that the massive roads that were supposed to be so like clean and beautiful and pristine actually tore apart neighborhoods, demolished, thousands upon thousands of homes. Like the costs of that promise of freedom were very abundantly clear right away. But I think I really did want to like kind of start from a place of like, the car is an amazing technological advance, and it's understandable that we sort of rallied around it. I think it's like we know better now. We need to stop spending so much money on this enormously expensive form of transportation.
It made the city where I am now in Phoenix accessible and attractive. Right. The highways that brought people from the east to the west, along with production housing, air conditioning, and a few other things. But you're right. It provided a degree of freedom that I don't have to live on the east side of the country. And actually, President Eisenhower wanted to see people pushing west. They wanted to inhabit the West in a different way and have businesses and other things located there. So yeah, there definitely was a degree of freedom affiliated with it. And those models that I was describing were pristine in their presentation of the future world. And obviously, it didn't turn out that way. One of the things that essentially the book is built around is the fundamental law of road congestion. Mm-hmm. So when you say cars are dirty, they're dirty in part because there are so many of them back to back and they're spewing exhaust and doing other things. But to this day, in Texas and elsewhere, including here in Phoenix, there's a belief we just need to widen the roads a little bit more. We just need to add some more arteries, and that will relieve the congestion. And as you point out, and have others, it's sort of the opposite. They will be filled almost immediately.
I think it's like an absolutely understandable reaction when you're sitting on a highway full of cars to say, let's make this highway bigger and like the cars will flow faster. But, you know, like you said, that's been disproved for 70 years. I had a traffic engineer say that, you know, I think engineers think that traffic functions like a liquid, that if a pipe is clogged up, then you need to make the pipe bigger and the traffic will flow more freely. But instead, traffic functions more like a gas, where it expands to meet the capacity allotted. Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of a little bit like it's not entirely intuitive to think that there's this latent demand for car travel that even when you make a highway wider, like the demand will simply fill up that capacity. But indeed, that was like a pretty fundamental question of my book is like, if we have known for 70 years that widening highways does not fix traffic, why are we still spending untold billions of dollars widening highways? And I think part of it is like, it's just simply a political and ideological problem, which we have been sold. Americans have been sold the idea that cars create freedom. And so when that car travel is constrained by capacity, the kind of response is let's create more capacity because that will create more freedom. I mean, that is very much the narrative that is being sold by political leaders in Texas. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that's true. I think that lots of people would say, I feel more free when I am not constrained by my car, when I don't have to pay $400 a month for a car payment, car insurance, et cetera. But like, that is the kind of myth that has been sold to us, which like obscures us from seeing the evidence, which is that widening highways does not fix traffic. You can certainly accommodate more cars. And maybe that is the ultimate goal, is to just allow more people to drive where they're going. But the promise that widening I-35 through Austin is going to get you where you're going faster is simply false. And yet the Department of Transportation is continuing to perpetuate that lie.
And in a time of a lot of political and other kinds of agitation, and we used the word freedom before, affiliated with the car, the reduction of lanes or not providing more freedom, as you just described it, doesn't sit well in these times, and maybe particularly in Texas. You're there, I'm not. But we set out the Tenor Cross project knowing it would move through Texas and California and Florida and other places, all of which have a different take on this. Is it also, I think, fair to say it's a function of the Highway Trust Fund that was built into the establishment of highways from the get-go, and that money was assumed to be for building highways, not building cities so much. And we'll talk about what highways have done to cities, but the money's there, we should spend it, and we should just build.
Yeah, I mean, President Eisenhower, when he sold the Interstate Highway Program to Congress, was very clear that it would be user-funded, that there would not be a new tax levied by non-drivers to pay for the Interstate Highway Program. And so that was done by diverting the gas tax, which had been in place for decades and just siphoned into the general revenue of the government. Mm-hmm. That would be siphoned into a newly created Highway Trust Fund. And that Highway Trust Fund would be used exclusively to pay for the creation of interstate highways. Mm-hmm. So it was like a very sort of self-financed program. And, you know, on paper, that sounds entirely reasonable. Drivers would pay for the highways that they themselves would use. The problem is that the Highway Trust Fund has long been insolvent. So general taxpayers subsidize the trust fund since, right, like, I think at least 2008. The general revenue is diverted to pay for roads. But because of this system, which by the way, was supposed to expire in the 1970s. I mean, the premise was the interstate highway system would be built out and the highway trust fund would be dissolved and that gas tax would go back into general revenue. But kind of, understandably, car companies, oil companies, concrete companies saw this dedicated source of revenue and lobbied very hard to preserve it. But even as far back as the 1970s, in my book, I read a lot of congressional records. So there was this whole debate in 1973 around, should we open up the Highway Trust Fund to fund transit, recognizing that highways are but one way to move people around. And then, in fact, the way that the financing was working is that cities were building highways to the exclusion of all other forms of transportation, like often in a way that was self-defeating, that it was like tearing up commuter rail. And
I think this was the Cooper-Muskie Amendment. Is that right? In the 70s that tried to push money in a different direction? Yeah.
Yeah. And it's was really remarkable to see legislators from both parties standing on the floor of the House and Senate saying, all of this money for highways is actually not fixing the problem we're trying to fix. It's making air pollution worse. It's not solving congestion. And it's decimating transit systems, which all the experts agree is the way to solve urban congestion. So it's self-defeating. We're not fixing the problem that we're promising to fix with all this money. And
some people perceive that if that money was for highways or is for highways, the movement of some of it to public transportation I don't know, reeks of socialism or something. Some can take a different, make a different observation about moving that money. But in fact, what was being proposed was to solve the problem, as you're pointing out. One of the things that can't be denied, and you and I both know this, I've spent a fair amount of time in the Fifth Ward in Houston. I lived in New Orleans for 10 years. As highways were threaded through, and I think it was Robert Moses that really insisted that we should move our highways right through the middle of cities, not around them. And yes, we have belt roads and other things, but these highways to serve cities should go right into them. And as you point out, as many have, that did great violence to communities. Why do you think that was the case, that what was so profoundly obvious, that moving people out of the way, displacing all those kind of people, was the way to go? And I know there's some difficult answers to that question.
Yeah, I mean, this also coincided with the era of urban renewal, when planners were very explicitly trying to get rid of quote unquote blighted areas, areas that had been denied access to credit and financing by the federal government a decade earlier through redlining, which I'm sure many listeners know about, when, appraisers went to neighborhoods like the Fifth Ward in Houston, and simply because Black people lived there, they downgraded them, and people who lived in those neighborhoods could not access credit. And so as a result, many of those neighborhoods were disinvested. There was no private financing. And so they, on their face appeared much poorer. And a decade later, it's time to build interstate highways, and planners saw this great opportunity to get rid of these so-called blighted areas. I mean, that's very clearly written in the historical record. It's just not a secret. So that was one dynamic, is that, hey, we have this large construction program and we can, solve two problems at once. I mean, it's worth saying that's an incredibly the racism is embedded within that. Simply because Black people live there, we should demolish these neighborhoods. And I think I found a study I just think that's cannot be overstated. I found a study that was done, I think in 2019, that red line neighborhoods were 3 times more likely to have an interstate routed through them than the best rated neighborhoods. So people who lived in these neighborhoods did not have the ability to resist interstates coming through them. Interstates were drawn through white neighborhoods, and people in those neighborhoods said, no, thank you. And they resisted, and they got those lines changed. They got them rerouted. I mean, New Orleans has a very famous example of a wealthy white neighborhood resisting a highway and a Black neighborhood being unable to do so. And I-10 was routed right through the Treme. So I mean, there's so many the history of American cities is wound up in racism, and interstate highways are no different. That the idea that there was this larger vision of progress, that we were going to build the suburbs and allow people to get home quickly. And the cost of that was demolishing, 500,000 homes, a lot of people's neighborhoods. And that was seen as an acceptable cost for the progress, quote unquote, that cars offered. So what's interesting about that issue in your book and the way you approach it, and I would say we find it in the work of other authors. I think a fellow
neighbor in Austin, Jeff Goodell, has been a good friend, and his book, The Heat Will Kill You First. He does that, as do others, in that they tell stories at a very personal level when it comes to things like, in his case, heat, or in your case, the impact of highways on communities. And now, especially, efforts to remedy those problems, knit things back together, or keep a new highway from being expanded. Tell me, as an author and as a journalist, the value of bringing the human dimension into this, because the amount of time that you appear to spend in public meetings, over kitchen tables with neighbors and other things seems vast. The amount of effort you put into getting to know real people and their daily lives is very apparent in the book. How do you think that helps to tell the story that you're really trying to get across about why we invest in infrastructure the way we do and the impacts of it?
Yeah, I mean, something that you learn very early on when you're a journalist is that the specific is much more powerful than the general, that people respond emotionally to stories of individual people in ways that they don't respond to with data. So reading a story about one person killed in an earthquake is much more powerful than saying 100,000 people were killed by an earthquake. And that's just like true that's just a truism of people like to read about people. Like that has been true throughout human history, right? Is like, we love narrative, we love stories about other people. And so like to make something emotionally resonant, it helps to get very specific. And so I've known that I learned that very early on in my training as a journalist. So when I set out to kind of tell the story of how interstate highways impacted American cities, I think it's been pretty well documented. Interstate highways were intentionally routed through Black and brown neighborhoods. And, the DOT has said 500,000 homes were destroyed. And that's a number so big as to be somewhat meaningless, right? It's a lot of homes, but I don't know how to I don't know how to engage with that. So I really wanted to find someone who was displaced, someone who lost their home because an interstate highway came through their neighborhood. So and the book takes place in 3 cities. And so I sort of started asking in all 3 cities, in Houston, Austin, and Dallas, trying to find a story of someone. And a lot of these people are, they're elders. A lot of people have died. Right. So it was, going door to door, basically trying to find people who knew people. So in the book, I tell the story of Oneri Goodry, who's a Black woman in her 70s, whose her family's home was demolished to make way for Interstate 10 in the 5th Ward in the 1960s. And, I found her by literally knocking on 4 different doors, someone's sister's friend's ex-husband led me to Oneri, it took a lot of knocking on doors to find her. Yeah. But once I did, hearing from her, I knew the history of Interstate 10 and the 5th Ward, but the way she talked about what her home was like, what the neighborhood was like, she was a teenager, so she has a pretty good memory of what the 5th Ward was like before that neighborhood was there. And we drove all over the neighborhood. I had her in the passenger seat of my car, and we drove all over the 5th Ward, and she would say, oh, this was here, that was there. This is where we used to go to do this thing. This had the best barbecue. This is where we went to church. I walked here to go to school. And that made it so much more vivid to me. And right. I think to readers is hearing, she talked very eloquently, being displaced by this highway, changed my life. She was a kid, and she just, I think as kids do, they just assume that they will be safe in their family's home. And then when that home was demolished, she really started to think about oh, maybe I need to think about how I will support myself. I need to consider being an adult in a different way. And, she was 14, but it really she talked about that being displaced by the highway made her think, oh, I need to have a career. I'm not just going to get married and live at my husband's house. And so she went to nursing school, as a result of that change. Yeah. And I think that those kind of personal stories, just, I find them so much more interesting. And I think readers do too, because you can Oneri, she's a person. She still lives in Houston, and she remembers what this neighborhood was like before a highway came through. And that for someone like me, I'm 37, I look at the 5th Ward and it's very hard to imagine anything else. That's true of highways across America. You look at them and it's very hard to conjure what was there before. But talking to people like her, elders who remember, you can begin to build a vision of the past, which is to say also a vision for the future. It doesn't have to be this way. This was the decision.
And obviously, having spent as much time in New Orleans as I did, Claiborne Avenue, which was this beautiful boulevard, tree-lined boulevard with live oaks and other things as you would see in that city, and the 10 now overwhelming that street with these small wooden shotgun houses and things sitting right there looking at this concrete structure. The decision to do that and move something this large into a neighborhood of that kind of delicacy, because New Orleans is all that. It's just a really fragile place. Even going past some of the historic cemeteries and other things, there are people who absolutely remember what Claiborne Boulevard was, because it was pretty magnificent and obviously is not that today. Although it's interesting how the highway structure in that neighborhood has been sort of weirdly repurposed. Into some cases, it's a shelter, unfortunately for those who don't have other shelter, but also parades and other things go through it. So it's interesting to watch communities adopt these things. So
the community is really just like grown around that neighborhood. Yes. It's like you do the, like a scar, you know, it's not like it was positive, but indeed you like adapt.
And even to the point where some wouldn't want to see it removed, not because they wouldn't like to see it gone. They just not want to live through the probably decade plus of dirt and dust and everything. So at this point in my life, as I'm aging, I just don't want to go through that, leave it. And so that's an interesting take, because you do talk about in your book highway removal, which is happening. I worked on the Big Dig in Boston as part of my career. So removal and capping, or removal meaning putting underground, or in our case, the 10 had a park put over it. We were sort of the golden spike for the 10 here in Phoenix. What do you think about capping as a substitute for just bashing the highway through the city, the expense, the possibilities, the time it takes to do that? Because it seems like a Band-Aid solution in a good way. It could ameliorate some issues, but does it avoid the real issue of how we navigate cities and highways?
Yeah, my thinking on capping has changed a lot over the course of reporting the book. Like early on, I went to Clydeborne Park in Dallas, which is, again, a park built over a depressed highway. And it's remarkable. It's this like conjuring of public space from polluted air and concrete. Like and it's very well activated. People use that park.
Absolutely.
You know, a summer evening, you're just like, this is glorious. What a miraculous place. But I have seen, as capping has become sort of quote unquote more mainstream, that DOTs are using caps to sell expansions. Like caps are a way to put lipstick on a pig, to say, hey, we're going to make car infrastructure and a highway expansion like a little bit more palatable to the urban fabric. And so in Austin, where I live, you know, I document in the book that TxDOT is going to expand I-35 from 12 to 20 lanes. It's a lot more lanes of traffic. It's going to take more than 100 properties, you know, something like 40 acres of land. And the city of Austin got a Reconnecting Communities grant to build a park over a stretch of that highway. And to me, like, I live a mile from I-35. I bike over it. I walk over it. I drive over it. Like, that will be better. Unquestionably, it will be better to have a park over a highway than no park. And yet, like, the reason that I started reporting this book and what really, like, kind of galvanizes me is, like, highways are fossil fuel infrastructure. Widening that highway is going to increase greenhouse gas emissions. It's going to increase air pollution, increase asthma. Like, that doesn't address any of the underlying problems of highways. And like, you know, it's getting hotter, it's getting drier, and widening that highway is only going to make the problem worse. It's going to like measurably and substantially increase greenhouse gas emissions. And like the park just makes that more palatable. And so I feel like it really kind of greenwashes highways.
Interesting. And I assume that Reconnecting Communities grant was part of the Secretary Buttigieg's administration and that set of monies, which, as you point out, as have others, while sounding pretty large, when you hear something that has a B in front of it, that sounds big, but not when the money that's going towards building more highways has hundreds of B's in front of it. I mean, billions of dollars. So I think the interest is sincere, but maybe not muscular enough to really solve these problems. Is that how you would perceive some of that?
Yeah, absolutely. And that gets back to the Highway Trust Fund, which we talked about before. The Highway Trust Fund sends, through formula funding, hundreds of billions of dollars to states like Texas to widen highways. And they don't have to justify their requests for funding. It just flows through formula. And so like programs like Reconnecting Communities are kind of trying to work around the edges. They're working with discretionary funding, which is just an absolute fraction of the whole. So like I had a source tell me like, we are like with one hand, we are inflicting a great amount of damage with a great amount of money. And we're trying with the other hand to like do some repair, but like that other hand doesn't have the same amount of resources. So we're like actively inflicting harm. Like the I-35 expansion is like, it's going to demolish affordable housing, childcare centers, community clinics. And
Right.
yet somehow we're supposed to believe that $100 million from the federal government is going to, quote unquote, reconnect our community. Like,
Right.
I don't buy it.
There you go. And it is a tough sell. And you are in Texas, and you quote a number of people who say they just don't believe, for example, mass transit will ever work in Texas. Texas is a culture of cars. So some people are hearing about that expansion saying, yeah, that's who we are. And somehow the other stuff that you just mentioned will get addressed. Talk about the transfer of the authority and decision-making from the federal government, Eisenhower, on to the states, where the states are making decisions with federal dollars, but really as they see fit, which seems just in theory a bit odd, but it does give something like the TxDOT immense power to make these decisions, hear out the public, but then move on with what they believe they need to do. That transfer from the feds to the states, this authority to make things happen. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, that was something I didn't know before I started reporting the book, but I should just name this source by name, Beth Osborne, who's the executive director of a nonprofit called Transportation for America. She used to work in Obama's DOT, and she really taught me that, like, the states are the emperors. The states have all of the power under the federal transportation system. It's a federally funded state-run program, and that's been baked in since the beginning. Since the program, under Eisenhower, he agreed to pay 90% of the cost of construction, but states basically had unilateral authority to decide where those highways would go. And that's where you get the discrepancy between Eisenhower saying, I don't want highways to go right through the middle of cities. I think they should connect cities, and states being like, actually, we're going to build highways through the middle of cities. They had all the power. And that remains true today. And even more so because of this formula funding system, which I can't remember. I think it was like 1998, the Surface Transportation Reauthorization established this funding mechanism that states do not have to basically request funding from the DOT, that it just flows to them automatically on gas tax revenue and population. And so that means that a state like Texas has, unquestioned billions of dollars every year that it can depend upon. And it as long as it doesn't break the law, it doesn't break environmental law or civil rights law, it can do whatever it wants with that money.
Right.
And I think that became really clear to me when in Houston, I document this massive highway expansion called the North Houston Highway Improvement Project. Lots of people, including a woman in my book who I profile, Modesty Cooper, filed civil rights complaints saying this project violates Title VI of the Civil Rights Act because it disproportionately impacts Black and brown people who are protected under the law. The federal government, FHWA under Buttigieg, paused the project to say, we need to investigate these serious civil rights concerns. And yet, TxDOT has so much authority and muscle that FHWA did not really have the authority to stop the project. After all that, that's what I heard from a lot of people, is that TxDOT, under what's called NEPA assignment, basically TxDOT has the authority to enforce its own compliance under federal law. And because of that, they basically, all FHWA can do is come in and say, hey, you need to cross these T's and dot these I's. You need to document the harm you're inflicting more thoroughly in your plan to mitigate it. But we don't actually have the authority to tell you don't inflict that harm.
And while I was reading that case, if you're the people you profile, you're hearing this and saying, oh, people are listening to us. It's being documented, so to speak. And then at the last minute, everybody's hearing that, but a decision is made which is contrary to that. So what does that cause you to think about so-called studies, environmental impact statements, and everything else, the value of them? Because like we talked about capping highways before, in some ways, those are a bit of a cloak to suggest that you are being heard as a citizen. And here is the documentation. But by the way, we're going to make the decision we're going to make. So that's a lot of effort. And you attended many meetings to hear out the impacts and the results of those studies. It makes you awfully skeptical of the value of that work, which is unfortunate because a lot of good people are doing very legitimate work to create these documents that give us insights of what's going to happen.
Yeah, I have very complicated feelings about NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, which was passed in 1970 largely to give people a voice. I think recognizing that as these massive public works projects, including highways, were built in cities, minority communities were disproportionately impacted and had no way to weigh in. And so this law passed that required any agency receiving federal funding to do really robust public engagement and get public input. But the law does not require action based on that public input. It simply requires to be collected and mitigated. And like the question of what is appropriate mitigation, what is sufficient mitigation, you know, like smarter people than me are thinking about that. But like, it certainly seems like TxDOT is saying in their environmental review of this project in Houston, all the impacts of the project will be just disproportionately borne by minority and low-income populations. And all they have to do is say, hey, here's how we're going to mitigate it. We're going to build affordable housing over here at some point in the future, even though that doesn't, like the people who live in that housing now that are going to get displaced can't move there because it doesn't exist yet.
Right.
Like, that is enough on paper to quote unquote mitigate the harm done by this highway expansion. And so like, you know, the public input process is flawed. I mean, it simply does not like, people are not given sufficient input. And I will like offer this caveat of like, I've also covered housing. The public input process through zoning change and housing creation is often what allows people to like deny affordable housing, to oppose affordable housing. People can go to city council and say, I don't want an apartment building in my backyard. I oppose that. And it's that same public input process that has like been weaponized to stop the creation of affordable housing. So like, I don't know what the solution is, but I think that current NEPA is very flawed. It's like a very flawed way to gather public input and like, and like how to make it actionable is a question that like, I don't know the answer to, but is interesting to me.
By the way, because it's in the news, before I ask the sort of final question here, what do you make about what happened in New York City? Where here's a thought about cars and roads and transportation and years of working out an idea to reduce congestion in one of the most congested cities and one of the most complex cities that Robert Moses and others helped to construct. And we think we're about to respond to congestion. And at the last minute, we don't, given that clearly there were a lot of quote unquote public meetings and other things preceding the idea about congestion pricing. What do you think about the governor's response there?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked me. So funny story. I went to New York to do a book event and I flew from Texas on that Wednesday morning and landed and turned my phone on. And I was like, oh, like, so I was in New York for the 3 days when Kathy Hochul made that initial announcement and people really responded. So it was like a really wonderful and fascinating time for me to be there as a journalist.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I have lots of thoughts. I think the first thing that was really striking to me is when Governor Hochul made that announcement, the kind of pre-recorded, I guess, press conference that she did. She said some things that I heard. She said something like, you know, this threatens the economic prosperity of New Yorkers.
Right.
You know, constraining car capacity. And that sounds a lot like what Governor Abbott says in Texas, is if we do not continue to invest in highways, we are going to threaten the economic prosperity of our state. Like, and I did this presentation in New York where I like put their two quotes side by side and they are saying very similar things. You know, these are people on very different sides of the political spectrum saying, if we constrain car capacity, it threatens our economic vitality. And that is really like revealing and alarming to me. I think that is false. I think there are lots of ways to disprove that, how like access to transit actually absolutely supports economic prosperity and like, you know, small businesses, and it supports people of low income who can then travel to access things they need and work. Like there's so many ways that prosperity is supported by transit, and the $1 billion that congestion pricing was going to provide to transit would have supported the economic vitality of New York. But like, it is such a persistent belief in America that like car travel creates prosperity. Like, and that is like, that was so remarkable to me to see that stated so bluntly by a Democratic leader, that it's just like Republicans do not have a monopoly on that belief. And I think like really, like the whole conversation around induced demand, like why aren't we including this evidence of 70 years that widening highways doesn't fix traffic, that adding car capacity does not make people drive faster. Like to me, the root cause is that we believe car travel creates prosperity. And like, if you really believe that, then of course you are going to spend billions of dollars of public money to support car travel. And so that, I guess my whole kind of, my take on the congestion pricing thing is like, lots of work needs to be done to dispute that narrative that like car-centric cities are actually punishing for low-income people. Car travel is very expensive. There are so many ways to measure prosperity in ways that like enabling car infrastructure above all else actually like makes people, like impoverishes people and impoverishes cities. And like, that is the heart of it to me, is like countering that narrative. So that, I don't know, that's my big takeaway. It's like, God, what a loss, $1 billion for transit. Like, I have been heartened to see the like kind of organization and advocacy pushing back against that assertion. And so I don't think it's over. I think the fight remains.
I'm certain of that. I guess it's not only the loss that is notable, but the abruptness by which it was delivered, and what appeared to be few people noticing that this was a possibility or an outcome. You know, we've sometimes said that the Tenant Cross project is on the front lines of the kind of things that are happening in the country. And so this link between how people are treating traffic in an auto-centric part of the country makes sense. To see that applied, as you've just pointed out, maybe inadvertently to some extent, to a very different political regime, a very different city, a very different place. It's just fascinating. Like you, I want to see where this keeps going. So let's make a mild effort to suggest there are some positive things out there. We have this system. It's enormous. We have these roads that go everywhere. We have these cities that have now just surrounded them, and vice versa. As you look at the future of roadways, and we're seeing electrification with the car, we're seeing samples of highways that actually might recharge batteries while you drive over them. That would be hugely expensive, but maybe autonomous vehicles and a variety of other things. As you see the shifts that are coming in transportation, and as I sit here in Phoenix, there are 600 autonomous Waymos going right past my window almost every minute. With people in them being used as cabs. The future is here. We're seeing this change. Where do you see opportunities for a shift in the status quo, or how we've been either building infrastructure or utilizing infrastructure?
I mean, I think people are increasingly seeing transportation as a climate fight. I mean, that begins my book, as transportation is the leading contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. And like, the electrification simply is not coming quick enough and will not solve that problem on its own. Like, we absolutely need massive amounts of electrification, but like, we also need to be driving less. So I think like, I see hope in a lot of people who are really taking the kind of car infrastructure on as a climate fight. Cause that's really what I think galvanized a lot of my reporting, is people, I think, don't still make that connection. I think the congestion pricing in New York is such a revealing example of like, we are spending a lot of money to perpetuate and build car infrastructure. And even just shifting a fraction of that would have a huge impact on American cities. Like, you mentioned this earlier, this narrative, and like, I hear this all the time in Texas. It's like, well, Texans love their cars, so like transit will never work here. We're sprawled, we're spread out. But like, myself, so many people in my community, so many people I interviewed for the book would love to take transit if it was available to them. And like, just shifting some of the $60 billion that we're going to spend widening highways in this state to transit would have an enormous impact on people's ability to move around, more cheaply, like without a car, which is very expensive, which is polluting. So I feel like there is this kind of growing realization of like, car travel is not inevitable, and it is not necessarily something people love. It's just like the only option. And so like, the reason I kind of like spent a lot of time documenting highway removal in the book, like the city of Rochester tore down its highway, Interloop Highway, other cities like San Francisco, Portland, Milwaukee have torn down highways, is like, I feel like that's just such a like compelling example that reveals how much space we have given to cars and like the opportunity cost. Like, that is a lot of land on which could be built housing, affordable housing. It could be built like market rate development that cities could tax and then have a much more prosperous property tax base. Every city in America needs more money to fund its basic services, education, like basic infrastructure. So like, I just think it's like, the reason I really focus on highway removal is it's like a relatively small project, like removing a 1.5 mile stretch of highway in Dallas would create like 300 acres of land and $9 billion of development potential. Like, I am not suggesting that like overnight we are going to get rid of highways or get rid of driving, but like, incremental change, like we have to start somewhere, right? Like this
Yep.
is simply not sustainable from a financial or environmental perspective. And like beginning to shift some money and some land, like it offers so much like possibility, I think. And that like seeing those examples on the ground provided me with a lot of hope. Like it's like in Rochester, that took 6 years. Like they tore down a stretch of highway and there are now apartment buildings that people live on. That's really hopeful to me.
Yeah. I could tell you stories about Boston and what that took and what that's become as a park. But even out here in a place that couldn't be more auto-centric, the establishment of a light rail line in 2008, which people poo-pooed, it caused this institution to build a whole campus in downtown Phoenix. And now we have housing developments springing up along that line, which are car-free. And the owners there do not have cars. As a matter of fact, it's a requirement. And you use light rail, you lose autonomous vehicles and other things. So to your point, it is possible, and there's an audience for that. Absolutely, positively, even in a place that was built around the automobile. Well,
I think there's a huge demand, and like we are just not
exactly.
providing.
Yeah, and I think that demand with regard to this housing has surprised other developers, and they're thinking, why didn't I do that? I built this garage. I built all these things to affiliate with the housing that I'm building. I didn't need to do that. There's an audience there that would like something else. So I think we're opening our eyes to other possibilities. And your book has absolutely helped us to do that. I know that's why there's so much interest in what you've had to say. So one, I really appreciate your work as a journalist and the topic of the book and your ability to articulate these really complicated issues so well.